I'm very pleased to introduce this edition of The World Today. Recent years have seen the American public grapple with individual and societal impacts of racism and what to do about it. And we're pleased to learn today from Theodore Ted R. Johnson about his book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. He's a senior fellow and director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School, where he explores the intersection of race, politics, and American pluralism. He's also a retired U.S. Navy commander, and his service included time as a speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as a White House fellow. Very pleased to have Dan Hopkins moderating this conversation. Dan is a professor in the political science department here at Penn with a secondary appointment at the Annenberg School. He helps coordinate the Philadelphia Behavioral Science Initiative, which helps the city of Philadelphia harness the best ideas and methods to meet the needs of Philadelphia's residents. Also, unfortunately for him, he went to graduate school with me and has known me a long time. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ted, who's has some opening remarks, and then he and Dan will have a moderated conversation, and then we'll open things up to the audience. So please join me in welcoming Ted.
Very good. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Dan, for doing this. And thank you all for being here, both in person and virtually. I will do my best to speak clearly through this. I talk expressively, so there's a lot of inhaling of the mask and exhaling, but I think it'll work. So look, I know that Perry Worldhouse thinks lots about foreign policy and global affairs, and this book is really about the threat that racism poses to the United States. But those two things are connected. And so I figured I'd start with a vignette that sort of expresses the connection and then pull back from that vignette to talk about some of the big ideas. I hope they're big ideas in the book. So where I want to start is on Route 40 in Maryland, which is not too far from here. Now, Route 40 in Maryland, before, as the interstate system is kind of being built, used to be a main thoroughfare between New York City and Washington, D.C. And so for foreign ambassadors that were in the United States, they would often go to New York because that's where the UN was, but they would have to come to DC to present their credentials to the White House or the State Department as just the sort of official duties as a new ambassador. Route 40 was often the route that they took to make that trip. So shortly after Kennedy becomes president, a number of sub-Saharan African nations had gained their independence. And as these nations gained their independence, they were sending ambassadors over. And when those ambassadors arrived, they would come to New York and then they would make the trip down to DC to present their credentials. The problem, of course, is that as they're making this drive down in this strip of Route 40 in Northern Maryland, that part of Maryland was segregated, racially segregated. And so you have these African ambassadors driving this road, deciding they need to use the bathroom, they need some coffee, they want some food, and they just pull off to the side of the road to go to a diner, and not knowing that these folks didn't serve Black folks. So one of the vignettes I capture in the book is about Adam Malick Sal, who is a new ambassador, and he's got a splitting headache, and he tries to go to the Bonnie Bray Diner on Route 40 in Northern Maryland. And when he walks in, they told him, well, we don't serve Black people here. A Life magazine article quotes the diner's owner, a white woman they only identify as Mrs. Leroy Merritt. And she says, I didn't know he was an ambassador. He just looked like a run-of-the-mill Negro to me, except she didn't say Negro. She said the N-word. As if to say, Black people, I don't care who they are, whether they're African-American or African ambassadors, are not welcome here. So this didn't just happen to him. It happened to a number of Black and African ambassadors from sub-Saharan Africa, so much so that the State Department began to take notice, and it got the attention of President Kennedy. The reason is because at the same time these African nations are gaining their independence, there is a Cold War ongoing where the United States is trying to gain influence with these newly independent nations, and so is the Soviet Union. And so when those ambassadors show up to America and we insult them by not giving them coffee, but we are the land of the free and the home of the brave, the land of equality and liberty and freedom, suddenly our narrative about who we think we are and who we are telling the world who we are seems hypocritical. It seems like a lie. And that harms our ability to compete in the Cold War when the Soviets, when we are telling the world we are this nation of liberty and opportunity, the Soviets would say, and you lynch Negroes. That's just to point out all this liberty and opportunity is only available for a select few. Black people in that country do not have access to it. And African ambassadors got caught up in the Jim Crow segregation that was happening in Northern Maryland. So this is a national security problem. This isn't just about some diner owners in Northern Maryland. This is now harming a national security interest for the United States of America. And this is why President Kennedy gets involved. First thing he does, of course, apologizes to the ambassadors. He tells the State Department, go talk to the governor of Maryland, see if they can work something out. Talk to the state assembly in Maryland, see if they can work something out. And these diner owners were like, it doesn't matter to me what the U.S. Objectives are. We don't want Black people in these diners. Or even if we were to allow it to happen, we would lose our white customers who don't want to dine with Black customers. So you're asking us to choose between a national security interest of which we will never benefit or won't see tangible benefits from, and our business, which is how we feed our families and which is how and it's the culture here. So it took several attempts, several appeals, but eventually they desegregated those diners for African ambassadors. If you were African American and tried to eat there, you were still turned away. But if you were an African ambassador, you were allowed to eat there because the national interest only extended as far as African ambassadors and did not include Black people writ large. So this is in fact, a couple of reporters from the Baltimore Afro-American, a Black newspaper, dressed up as African ambassadors from the fake African nation of Gabon, and they were served. But when they were not in the fake African garb, they were turned away. The point of this story is to say that even in those times where we have made progress on race that led to desegregation of diners along Route 40, it only extended as far as the national interest required. This wasn't done out of morality. It wasn't done out of principle. It wasn't done because there was a wave of epiphanies that washed across these folks in Northern Maryland. It was because there was a national security interest that was appealed to by the president, the State Department, the governor of Maryland, and the state assembly. And then once that interest was satisfied, which was to say, do not offend these African ambassadors, job's done. And never mind that these Black folks in Maryland, Americans, weren't served there, not my problem, or a problem for another day. It was several more years before, after a number of protests and activism by groups in Northern Maryland, before Route 40 became completely desegregated. But again, the fact that it didn't happen in concert with the desegregation for African ambassadors is noteworthy. Now, I bring this up because this is it sort of demonstrates a threat to the nation's ontological security. And this is a term that international relations folks have been using for a while now, but it's essentially when a nation's identity or sense of itself is called into question, that nation takes that questioning as a threat in the same way it would a threat to its economy or a threat to its physical security. So when you threaten a nation's sense of itself, they will defend that threat with the same fervor, passions, and energies as if you had just blown up a building or if you had just sanctioned their economy. So what the Route 40 incident shows us is that the nation's ontological security was harmed. It wasn't their economy, it wasn't a physical attack, it wasn't even a diplomatic, strictly a diplomatic thing. It was because we were called out to be hypocrites on the world stage by the Soviets and others that caused us to act. Here's a more recent tangible example of ontological security. If we think to 9/11 and think about the buildings that were attacked or targeted on 9/11, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the White House. Flight 93 was supposed to hit the White House, but because of some passengers on board, they took the plane down in Pennsylvania before it got there. If we think about what makes America a superpower, it's our military power, unrivaled, our economic power, unrivaled, and we have the longest constitutional democracy in the world. If you look at the symbols of our military, it's the Pentagon. You look at the symbols of our economy, it's the World Trade Center. The symbols of our democracy, the White House. And so those targets were chosen because they specifically targeted the things that we identify as making us exceptional, the things that are the source of our superpowerness. And so this was not just targets of opportunity or symbolic targets. These were targets that sought to threaten our ontological security, our sense of who we are, of what makes us special, of what separates us from the rest of the world. when a nation's ontological security is targeted, it will do what it takes to recover that sense of stability. What I argue in the book is that racism presents an ontological security threat to the United States, and not just to the geopolitical entity of the United States, because the United States, this entity, has shown that it can live quite comfortably at times with racism. There was chattel slavery for hundreds of years. There was Jim Crow for several decades after slavery was abolished. And structural racism still continues to pervade our society. So our nation state can coexist with racism. But the ideal of America that we are, and frankly, I call it the promise of America in this book. The promise of America is the first 3 or 4 lines of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which says, we're all created equal, that we all have unalienable rights, including among these is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. In my view, that's the promise of America. Nothing in that promise is compatible with the presence of racism. And so whenever the promise surges forward, whenever we make progress towards it, racial inequality, structural racism period, recedes. And whenever racism is allowed to take priority or take salience in any given situation, then the promise recedes. These two things cannot coexist. And so racism, the core argument of the book is racism, structural racism, is an existential threat to America, the idea of America, not the geopolitical entity of the United States. What Black Americans have tried to leverage from our existence in this country is to try to demand our equality by leveraging the threat, the ontological security threat that is presented by the gap between who we are and who we say we are as a nation, and the moral claim to equality that's guaranteed to us in the promise. If we only try to move nation states by appealing to their morality, we will fail because nation states are amoral. They don't have a sense of morality. What is good for a nation is what's in its interest, and what is bad for a nation is what's not in its interest. And interests change depending on the world around it. When the nation was founded, it determined that it was in its interest to allow slavery to persist. And 90 years later, it decided that it was in its interest to go to civil war and have 1 million casualties in order to reunite the country. So in just 90 years' time, the thing that was in its interest to ignore became the thing that was in its interest to abolish, both in service of the same thing, the Union, creation of the Union at the founding of the country and reunification during the Civil War. Nothing about the evil of slavery changed in that time frame. The only thing that changed was the interest of the United States. So if we only try to make moral arguments about the goodness or badness of things, the morality of a thing, we cannot necessarily compel. It's very, very difficult to compel a nation to take action, especially when that action requires resources, admissions of like responsibility, and essentially admitting to its shortcomings. And so the Black experience has shown that when you can marry a moral claim to a national interest, then you can make a nation state do something that it wouldn't normally do. I gave you the example of Route 40 in Maryland. This was in 1960, 1961. But if we think about the greatest period of racial progress in the country in the 20th century, it happens between 1948 and 1968. 1948, you get Truman that signs the executive order desegregating the military and the federal workforce. In 54, you get Brown v. Board, which said, separate but equal is no longer constitutional. 57, you get Eisenhower sending the 101st Airborne to Little Rock High School in Arkansas so that 9 Black students can go to school. And he does the same thing for James Meredith at the University of Mississippi so that 1 Black student could be admitted to the university. The 101st Airborne. 1957, there's also a Civil Rights Act. 64, there's another Civil Rights Act. 65, there's the Voting Rights Act. 68, there's the Fair Housing Act. Now, these 20 years of progress between 48 and 68 is not the result of Martin Luther King marching, saying no justice, no peace. It's not the result of another wave of epiphanies happening across America that finally convinced folks that the humanity and the dignity of Black folks should be recognized. What's happening is we are in a Cold War. And again, the Soviets are exposing our hypocrisy at the UN in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and everywhere else where great power struggles are happening. They are calling us liars. that we don't believe in equality, that we don't believe in democracy, that we don't believe that we all have these unalienable rights and that we were created equal. And that is a threat to our ontological security and our national interest. So when Black folks were able to show that the United States was not who it says it was, the nation was compelled to behave differently because of the Cold War, because of the threat that the Soviets presented. If you think about the visuals of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement was a bunch of Black folks in their best clothes, marching with nonviolence and often attacked with fire hoses, police batons, German shepherds. It isn't very difficult to see who is behaving barbarically in that situation. This was another way of exposing the true character of the United States as a way of compelling it to recognize that that was the thing that was being threatened, and it wasn't Black folks that were threatening our democracy. So if this is a concept in the book that I call trickle-down citizenship. It's the idea that that marginalized groups will only realize as much of the promise as the national interest is interested in. And if you cannot show why it's in the nation's interest to extend the full rights and protections of citizenship to more people it used to exclude, then it will not happen. You can't make the moral case alone. You have to show why it's in its interest. And this is the Black experience shows this. The two other things that I pull out in this book that I think we'll talk about some are concepts of superlative citizenship and concepts of sort of like groups or racial solidarity. The whole point of the book is to show not only that structural racism presents a threat to America, our ideals, but that Black American experience in this country provides lessons for how to create a multiracial solidarity that will make the nation be a better version of itself, that will close the gap between who we say we are in our founding documents and who we actually are on a daily basis. And the third piece of that suggests that the solidarity that we see among Black Americans is it can be replicated across races as long as we make some appeals to our founding beliefs, our sort of doctrine. So I think I'm getting close, but what I want to give you some of the other arguments that are in the book. Okay, so the basic argument is structural racism is a threat to our American ideals. Black America, our history, our experiences hold lessons for how to create a multiracial solidarity, and that Black solidarity sort of sketches some of that out. A second batch of arguments is that is the superlative citizenship piece. These are the three sort of pillars of what this multiracial solidarity needs. Superlative citizens, a recognition of trickle-down citizenship, or the relation between morality and the national interest, and then the importance of finding solidarity that is based on experience and not based on material things like higher wages or something like that. And then the third set of arguments is that racism is a crime of the state. It's not an issue that white people need to work out with Black people or that people of color need to work out with others. The presence of structural racism is the product of a nation that was constructed on a set of policies that built in inequality across gender, class, race, etc. And that nation today has said that kind of policy is incorrect, but has not sufficiently addressed the harms from those previous policies so that people born into this country today don't face the disparities that previous generations have faced. And so that inability to do so or unwillingness to do so is essentially a breach in the social contract. And this is why I call racism a crime of the state. This is something for the state to remedy. This is not something for people of color and white people to work out in kumbaya, and then the United States will follow. Public policy will create the nation we need, and not necessarily just handshakes amongst us. The second is that the fulfillment of the American promise is not a colorblind meritocracy. It must be color conscious. And that doesn't mean quotas. It doesn't mean race-specific things, but it does mean that race should be a factor. Whenever we put something in place, we have to consider how different groups are affected by the things we're putting forward. And if we don't do that, all we do is put in new structures that replicate the disparities that the existing ones already produce. And the third is that we need a common set of beliefs. The only thing that unites us in this room or out in Zoom land is the promise of America. It's not our race, it's not our nation of origin, it's not our religion, it's not our languages, it's not our customs and cultures. The only thing that unites us is this belief that we're created equal, that we have certain unalienable rights, and that government derives its just power from the consent of the governed. And so what the book appeals to is a sense of civil religion. And I can talk a little bit more about this later, but a civil religion is essentially the belief system that connects us in this country. And I think appealing to that civil religion is how we can find connection across difference. The book concludes with a set of recommendations, need for more civic education, the need for deliberative democracy, the need for reform of our democratic institutions, a national service program, and the power of transformative leadership. But when it all is said and done, each chapter is a little puzzle piece that by the end of the book creates a picture that I hope looks a little bit different from what folks have encountered before. So I'll take a breath there and we can jump into some conversation.
It's great. First, I just want to congratulate you on what is such an impressive, learned book. And it's remarkable in how synthetic it is. So many of the books that we read here in universities are often kind of monochromatic in the sense that they focus on, they're telling one story and they tell it through one lens. And instead you weave your family's anecdotes together with a rich depiction of contemporary American politics and a deep understanding of the way in which scholars and leaders have grappled with these questions for generations. So first off, this book was a gift, and if I don't see any of my students, but my students would know that I don't say that lightly. So one question that I wanted to start us off with is the challenge that a lot of the examples that you cite of significant racial progress during the civil rights era come in a period when, exactly as you say, we are within the Cold War, and we have a very, very clear adversary. And this contemporary period of American political polarization, which is intertwined with racial division, really starts in the 1990s, almost as soon as the Cold War ends. And I think it's plausible that one of the things that changes is that the Cold War removes guardrails where we would never let ourselves during the Cold War debate defaulting on the American debt, because that would make us look like the laughingstock of the world, right? So one question too, you make a powerful argument that Black political solidarity can provide a model for American solidarity. One of the challenges is that Black solidarity exists in response to discriminatory practices and racism, white racism. And so I'm curious how you think about the challenge of building group solidarity without the same clear adversary that we had during the Cold War.
Yeah, this is tough, and a lot of political scientists, sociologists suggest that without the presence of a threat or an other, that it's hard to create unity among such a diverse nation. And I don't think that's unfounded. What I would say is, even in those moments of national unity, racism is not only present, but acted on in a way that furthers the exclusion of people of color. For example, World War II is looked back, this is the greatest generation. These are the folks that are war bonds and gardens and all these things that America is doing to ensure our boys overseas win. And we're also interning Japanese Americans. We're literally rounding up Japanese people and putting them in camps because we think they might be spying. We're also at war with Germany and Italy, but we didn't round up German Americans or Italian Americans. A few foreign nationals we rounded up, but not them. That's a question of that's a problem of racism. It's not a problem of Japanese Americans, not wanting to be part of this country or sort of a fifth column kind of thing. After 9/11, tremendous unity, unless you were Arab or even Sikh, and in which case hate crimes spiked and mobs were defaced. Again, even in a moment of tremendous national unity, racism rears its ugly head. The argument I make in the book, and I don't know how successful I do it, is that racism is that thing, is that other. And either we can address it, it is literally the only thing that broken the country in two, was the question of, can Black people be American? And so if that doesn't present as something the Soviets never did, the Brits never did, the Germans, Italians, Japanese never did, Vietnam, North Korea, the only thing that ever broke the country was the question of where do Black people fit in this nation. Racism has accomplished something that nothing else has. I don't know how else to point to that threat except to point those things out. But I will say this, I did think that COVID would be an instance where a non-war threat would bring people across difference together. And what happened? It was weaponized along lines of race and xenophobia. The Chinese flu, the Wuhan virus, hate crimes against Asian Americans spiked, and even so much so that Congress passed a hate crimes law specifically for COVID-19 hate crimes against Asian Americans. So in opportunities of tremendous national unity, we still find a way to other people based on their race or ethnicity. This is the threat. This is the threat. Now, if we don't choose to recognize it, then we are communicating to ourselves and to the world who we really are. And I am calling on us in the book, and as many others have for centuries, to be a better version of who we say we are. And if racism isn't the thing that compels us to action, then either we will lose this experiment, or something else will come along that will mute the racism that's present in our society, but only for so long as that other threat that arises disappears. I don't think we need to wait for another world war to recognize the Americanness in our fellow citizens, but we will see if we're up to the task or not.
Indeed. One of the things that to me was so powerful about the book is that it deals with these complex topics that are interwoven with what it means to be an American from any racial background. And one of the challenges that I've had is that a lot of the ways that I have related to these questions are often through social media. Mm-hmm. And social media is such a flattening kind of mode of discourse, right? You can communicate in very, very short snippets that only allow you to say basically one note. Right. And so I wonder how you think about, and to me, your book was so eye-opening and refreshing precisely because you could lay out your family history. You could explain the heritage of your name in detail and capture some of the complexities and the ambiguities, the tension between the relentless hope that's so evident in many African-American political projects and the real deep challenges that are embedded and persist generation after generation. So I was curious how you think about sites for talking about and working on racial difference in an era when so much communication seems to happen in a flattened, soundbite-oriented, extremist kind of way.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. There is no bumper sticker for the book. There's no bumper sticker for the ideas in the book. There's no pithy statements. There's nothing that captures the fullness of the argument the book makes. The things that have caught on, racism is a crime of the state, or that the importance of civil religion, even those things are just a microcosm of the broader argument. So it's been hard for it to catch on in social media. It's just not, racism writ large is not a topic that is good for social media, cable news, the sort of soundbite politics that we have. And proof of that is in the fight around the 1619 Project, the fight around critical race theory. We're not actually having conversations about history curricula in public schools. We're having a conversation about our character, our identity. Is America good or bad? Is it a racist nation or not? And those lend themselves to sound bites in ways that real conversations about legal frameworks and real conversations about the structures that perpetuate racial disparity require. So I have not done a good job of talking about this book in social media because nothing in it lends itself to 280 characters for tweets. But here's the thing, and I mean, you mentioned this, and I should have said it up front, but the book is probably a quarter memoir that traces my family's American story from slavery through to my time in the Obama White House as the White House fellow. And so whenever the frameworks, the theories get a little too thick, I basically give the reader a break and say, let me tell you about my great-grandfather and why, despite growing up in Jim Crow, Georgia, he still loved America. And let me tell you about my mom, who, despite being born 2 years before Brown v. Board was decided and entering public school after Brown v. Board, never attended a desegregated school. Elementary, middle school, high school, and then she went to an HBCU for college. Her first time in an integrated environment was when she was hired by IBM when she graduated from Shaw University in 1974. So 22 years old and has never been in a room where she's the minority. This is, again, decades after Brown v. Board said that this was unconstitutional. So it's easy to poke holes and say, well, these structures are bad or that law was bad. But I try to put flesh and bone on some of these ideas. So you can't dismiss Sandra Johnson as easily. You can't dismiss, Joe Humphrey as easily as you can critical race theory, because you now see it. So what has helped me is writing about one or two of these ideas in a op-ed, an essay or something, but leaning into the personal narrative as an entree, as sort of a welcoming for folks who normally wouldn't want to hear about racism to the conversation. The last thing I'll say on this is right after George Floyd was murdered, I wrote a 5,000-word essay for the National Review, a very conservative magazine, telling them why what happened to George Floyd was not just a matter of a bad apple cop and a guy who tried to pass a counterfeit 20, but how it tells a bigger story both about race in America and about the abuses of state power in the United States. And I lead with talking about my time as my final days as a Navy commander, being asked about Colin Kaepernick, who had just started kneeling for the national anthem, and having to share with my colleague in the Pentagon that I've been pulled over nearly 40 times by police since I've been driving from 16. And so that this isn't an abstract question for me, is whether police are good or bad, or whether state agents abuse their power. This is real. And I'm the father of 3 Black boys, and I have to send them out to the world. 2 of them are driving. These are real questions. And so usually that personal angle works for social media, because people will say, I just read this incredible story about this Black veteran. That works on social media, that then points people to the longer form pieces that unpack some of the ideas that are in the book. And that's the sort of the alley-oop, or the skipped rock that I try to get people from social media to the longer form argument.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I just found some of these questions have to be dealt with in long form, that you cannot summarize such a deep issue in American history in a single tweet. And that right. Your book kind of freed me to then stop looking for kind of salvation in 280 characters. So one question though, which comes up a lot, is the question of racism and how we should define it. Because in recent years, there's been a real movement to expand how we think about racism, right? So one definition of racism is a very narrow definition that would encompass what happened on Route 40 very clearly, but would not encompass more structural or more incidental kinds of interactions. But in recent years, and I think our students here at Penn have been very useful in educating me on this, there's been a palpable movement to expand the definition of racism, to take interactions, to take interpersonal engagements, and clearly to take state action, public policies that we didn't used to conceive of as racist, and reconceive of them as having racist grounds. I was curious both how you think about the definition of racism, and if you think there is any tension in highlighting racism and building national solidarity across races at the same time.
Yeah. So the trick now, or the easy way to talk about racism today, is just to say that it's a matter of heart, someone's heart, because that way you absolve the government of any responsibility to do anything about people's hearts unless they act on that heart in a criminal way. And so racism is then reduced to essentially hate crimes. And if it's not a hate crime, it's not racist, then we can go about our business. But the expansion of racism to include everything that produces racial disparity could be, maybe, I don't know if too broad is the right way to characterize it, but I think it's closer to the kind of racism that public policy intentionally can address. So one of the examples I use in the book is around home buying. If you take a white family and a Black family, similarly situated in terms of income, education, et cetera, it will be harder for that Black family to buy a house. Their credit score will be different. Their opportunities for getting a mortgage will be different. The interest rate they get on that mortgage will be different. The places where they can buy, we have evidence that real estate agents tend to steer people to neighborhoods that they perceive that family to be more comfortable in, so they steer Black people to Black neighborhoods, et cetera. I know from selling that when you're a Black family trying to sell a house, that you often have to take the pictures down. so that people don't know that they're buying a Black person's home, because that actually impacts the value or how much you can get, which is most people buy homes by selling a previous home and taking the equity from that previous home for down payment for the next home. This doesn't mean that all bank agents, real estate agents, mortgage officers, et cetera, all have personal hatred for other races. It just means the way our system is structured, that two families similarly situated, one is going to have a harder time. That is structural racism at work. And it doesn't suggest that anyone involved has a bad heart about it. But it does suggest that there's a role for public policy to play, such that the decline to the American dream is not steeper for one just because of their race or ethnicity. So I think that is the proper definition of the kind of racism public policy is suited to address, and the kind of policy that will help us become a better version of ourselves. So the hard part, though, is if everything that produces racial disparity is racist, then that means everything is racist, because racial disparities exist in health and education and housing and jobs and wealth. I mean, it's in every part of our society. And I don't believe that our nation is racist. I do believe our nation is structured in a way that produces racial inequality or racial disparity. So I often try to limit racism to institutions and procedures, instead of a catch-all saying everything in this nation is racist, therefore the nation is racist, which makes it feel like the problem, the elephant that's too big to consume, or and sort of try to take it in bite-sized chunks. But there are people of different minds about this, and I don't know that I make either side happy. Either nothing is racist or everything is racist. I sort of fall somewhere in between. But I do believe, generally speaking, that the way forward is the old public policy maxim to be hard on institutions and soft on people. And so instead of making racism a personal problem that we have to work out with one another, I say let's work to get the disparate impacts that public policy produces out of our structures, and that way we can become a better version of ourselves.
Indeed. And that way of thinking can address not just racism, though racism is obviously an ample topic, but also things like climate change, right? How do I think about the relationship between my own personal actions and systemic actions? And I think that I would wholeheartedly agree that we need to be thinking about interpersonal activities, but also, and I think one of the many things that I think is so admirable about your book is the way in which it really focuses on institutional and political kinds of questions. In the last few years living here in Philadelphia, at times I get pessimistic seeing that though there are great changes in certain policy areas, the Philadelphia public schools still have deep challenges. I mean, just to point to one thing, we cannot bus our children to school in a reliable way. And that is the product of the legacy of so much of what you write about.
Right, yeah, absolutely. It affects everything. And so the only way out of it is to sort of chip away at it, slow, one by one, socioeconomic by socioeconomic factor, institution by institution. But it does require solidarity across racial lines. It does require a sort of enduring solidarity, one that isn't episodic. Like, I think after George Floyd was murdered, I think we saw an episodic version of national solidarity that quickly turned, and by January 6th, where there's so much dissension in the public that the Capitol is stormed. So the book calls for us, like, it's a big calling, and I don't shrink away from that at all. And I don't know if we're up to the task, but I do know that this thing is not inevitable. And if we assume that if we just keep being good people and just keep doing the best for our families, that the whole nation will sort of work itself out, it's not that easy. Every period of progress has required activism, energy, commitment, dedication, solidarity, sacrifice, forbearance, and either we will do those things or we won't. But the outcome is not predetermined.
Indeed. And you so eloquently point to elements of the Black community. Do you want to say just a little bit more about superlative citizenship and how you see that as one of the pathways to address these deep challenges we've been talking about?
Yeah, so superlative citizenship is the idea that when the nation state is in breach of the social contract, that individuals can overperform their duties as citizens as a way of exposing the hypocrisy or drawing attention to the breach. The example that I give, one of the few examples I give is about a man named Jehu Grant, who was enslaved during the Revolutionary War. And he runs away from his plantation in Rhode Island, joins Washington's army in Connecticut, and serves for nearly a year in the Continental Army, hoping that if he fights for the nation's independence, that he will be given his freedom as a result. But what happens is his owner shows up to the army base and says, "You have my property." And the army says, "My bad," and gives Jehu back to the owner, who's been returned to slavery. And Jehu was sold a few times. He eventually gains his freedom and dies 80 years old, blind, penniless, and essentially alone, despite having served in the Revolutionary War for the nation's independence. In 1832, I believe that's the right year, when Andrew Jackson or Congress passes a law that says if you served in the Revolutionary War, you are due a pension for your service. And Jehu Grant, now old and again indigent, applies for his pension, and they are told, because you were a slave during the time of your service is not recognized, period. And the only way we know Jehu exists is because the government held a record of the rejection of his pension request. And he writes back to the rejection to say, "Look, I couldn't help myself. I know it was wrong for me to run away, but I paid my master back for that time. But I couldn't help myself when he said something about the toll of liberty's bells kept calling me, and I couldn't resist." And so, and that's the last we know of what happens to Jehu Grant. So a man who was enslaved, fights for the country's independence, gets nothing in return except more slavery. That is a superlative citizen. When World War I and II Black veterans returned home only to be lynched, sometimes in uniform, that is superlative citizenship. To fight for democracy, make the world safe for democracy, and your neighborhood isn't safe for democracy extended to you, that is superlative citizenship. When Black women and churches in the early 20th century practiced a respectability politics that's fallen out of favor in the current version of activism, but then Black women were mostly domestics, working, rearing people's children, washing laundry, cooking. They were always in the presence of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, whatever. Respectability politics was basically their way of fighting back. If they spoke properly, if they dressed well, they couldn't be treated like animals, because the people who employed them had to recognize their humanity, because it resembled the same cultural things, the dress, the diction, etc., of the people that they worked for. This was a political strategy. I'm named Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III because my great-grandparents named my grandfather after the sitting president once he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House. First time ever a Black man has been invited to dine socially at the White House. That was an act of political activism. That was political activism. That was a claim on the American dream. These are acts of superlative citizenship by people who never got the types of democracy that I get to enjoy today. And it's only because of those acts that our notion of who is included is as expansive as it is today versus when my forefathers and ancestors were around. It's not an attractive strategy to suggest you should do everything the state asks of you and more in hopes that that some future generation will reap the benefit. But it is proven successful, not just on questions of race, but questions of gender. Women fought and for many, many years to get the right to vote and didn't get it until 1920. There are immigrants who fought for many, many years to be included. And immigrants, it was in the 50s or 60s before we start demonizing them in ways that had happened beforehand. Native Americans weren't even citizens of this country until last century, despite them being predating the nation. But the sacrifices of previous generations allowed posterity to enjoy benefits. And frankly, when we call America an experiment or a project, it is a long haul project. We're trying to accomplish something that no other nation has done before, creating a multiracial, egalitarian, liberal, democratic republic, and based on a constitution. And that's not been done before, but to think that we can achieve it tomorrow is unrealistic, but to think that it cannot be achieved, I also think is not realistic. And it just requires the journey to be more important than every generation realizing the fullest benefits of the promise possible.
Great. So let's pause for a moment and see if any of our colleagues here have questions. Good.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's fascinating. I study Chinese politics, and I'm very concerned that there seems to be a Cold War brewing between the US and China. And I read Chinese media and see that, just as you mentioned about the Soviet Union, China is using a lot of attacks against the U.S. as a society to argue the U.S. is hypocritical and has double standards and is false and is racist. I was wondering what you thought about the opportunities and risks of a conflict between the U.S. and China for African Americans.
Oh, what a great question. So a few things. I mean, one, I think you're right that there are a lot of folks pointing to, oh, look, China's got a nuclear tipped supersonic missile. This is now a great power competition and we need to organize against China. It's sort of all hands on deck. Meanwhile, China, I think I read a couple of days ago that they have outlawed critique of their heroes in China, which sounds very much like what's, the uncritical kind of patriotism that there are elements of American society. So this is the part that concerns me, that we see imminent danger in one another. At the same time, we're crystallizing our exceptionalism. Can't critique Chinese heroes. We can't talk about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson being slave owners because that harms the American narrative. So we can't tell kids about racism because they won't love America. We need those kids to fight China when that time comes. There's like this two things happening at the same time that I'm really worried about. As it pertains to African Americans, I see it like, what do the persecuted in mainland China, what do they think about Chinese narratives? And frankly, I don't think much of China cares about it. It's like, keep those voices down, and it's okay if they're oppressed. It's not in our national interest to extend human rights protections to certain groups. And I think there's elements of that in the United States, not to the same extent anymore, but certainly elements that says, look, it's not in the national interest to address all of these disparities between Maine American, the median American, and Black Americans. But here's the thing, if war happens, African Americans will be the only group overly represented in the military force that goes to war. That's how it's been. I think Native Americans sometimes tip over, sometimes below, but Black folks are the only racial ethnic group in the country overrepresented in the military force. Not because we're better patriots, but because of the economic benefits of military service make it attractive to a people who have been excluded from a lot of economic gains otherwise. So this is a way of saying that African Americans will be subject to the national interest and will fight for the national interest as they have since the nation's inception. And to the extent some try to say that the moral clarity that may emanate from the Black American experience may move the nation to take a different course of action, I don't see that happening at all. I don't think the Black American experience is a voice the nation is willing to listen to the extent that it will change its national security interests. So that's I don't know that there's much intersection there in either propelling the nation forward in this hurtling us towards competition or pulling us back from the brink of it. I think based on how Black folks are situated in our society, we will be subject to the national interest instead of an influencer.
And you got another question up here.
Great.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. And that's actually, I'm going to piggyback off of that excellent question, because half of my question. But it ties into what you said earlier about the Cold War being one of the times when we came closest to the promise of the United States because it was a matter of national security. That other nation, the Soviet Union was calling us out of our own hypocrisy, and in the interest of not being hypocrites, we moved closer towards a more union. Given what we've already just discussed about how the CCP and CCP is behaving towards human rights, for example, how do you feel about this maybe being another opportunity to push things forward on a national security sort of rationale towards a better balance of the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. So part of it is that I don't know that most Americans feel China is an existential threat in the same way that they feel about the Soviets. And some of that is because it's so new. I mean, there was a time in the 80s where Americans were worried about the Japanese because of their economy and thinking that they would overtake us and harm our ability to pay wages, et cetera. And I don't know if China certainly hasn't reached the level of fear that I think existed among Americans with the Soviets. And so I think that's part of it. But in a decade, if we're constantly fed this narrative of they're coming, they've got more people, they now have a bigger economy, they have a military structure, not for world patrol, but for defeating America. Whereas we have a military built to do like multiple things in multiple places, they have a military meant to keep us out of their backyard. maybe then something sparks. But I think it will take, I'm not sure. But I will say this, that there was another opportunity after the Civil War. Reconstruction was a chance for us to really get things right. And it was domestic politics that broke the back of the gains we had made after the Civil War, when, in the Compromise of 1877, where basically Democrats and Republicans made a deal for the White House that included removing federal troop protections from Black folks in the South, that effectively led to disenfranchisement in the voting booth, and then led to these, the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if there is a domestic thing that will happen that will unite us, and then that will precede a sort of opposition to China, or if China will be deemed such a threat that then domestic politics change, and then that unity results from there. But I am very wary of any kind of unity that results by finding someone else to hate. And it's proven to be very effective politics and good for getting budgets increased for national security. But in the long run, the problem of racism just rears its head. And if you thought racism against Asian Americans was bad post-COVID, then a war with China, Korematsu that basically said what FDR did in turning Japanese Americans was constitutional was never overturned. That's still, I think in the Guantanamo case recently, they said nothing here said that we agree with Korematsu, but there was nothing that said what the president did in turning Japanese Americans was not constitutional, because there's such deference to the executive. So a war with China could lead to a whole bunch of illiberal and racist and xenophobic policies that look a lot like Jim Crow. And just because Black folks aren't the subject, aren't the target of it, nothing about the targeting of Arab Americans after 9/11 changed the experience of Black folks. Nothing about the targeting of Asian Americans after COVID changed the experience of Black folks, or Hispanic folks, or Jewish folks, or immigrants. So race, I still see as central to it. And to the extent that this plays into a conflict with China, I think will only exacerbate the threat racism poses, instead of like muting racism because we've now got a new person to hate.
We have a final question.
Great, go ahead.
Thank you folks so much for this, for a wonderfully moderated conversation and just topics that we often don't hear in the Perry World House spaces. But I fear I know the answer to this question is bothersome, because is there a path to the promise of America that does not involve the further traumatizing exploitation and sacrifice of Black, Brown, Asian, Native American men, women, boys, and girls? Because every time something horrific happens, people view it as a learning opportunity, a teachable moment, but it comes at such trauma to communities that, is there another way, or is this the only way we know how to progress?
Well, so, I mean, if you look at our history, it suggests that political violence usually attends progress, or precedes it, or the backlash that comes with it. I would say if there's a silver bullet, it is that I think the stat I have in the book is something like 83% of white Americans don't have a single person of another race or ethnicity in their social circle. And it's that's 83% of Black Americans. It's something like almost 90% of white Americans. It's rich to say we don't live around each other, we don't know each other, our kids don't go to school together, even at the job, our interactions are typically superficial and don't extend beyond there. And this isn't just a matter of public policy. We self-segregate into communities where we feel more comfortable, which tend to be communities that are more homogenous based on our demographic. So if there's a silver bullet, it's that we have to either, through public policy, incentivize social connections across difference, and at the individual level, seek out being uncomfortable in places where we're not in the majority. Because only getting to know the other people in this democratic project with us, that's the only way we can become more resilient to divisive, racist, xenophobic, et cetera, appeals that those with power typically exploit in order to prevent solidarity among the people and sort of compelling government to be more responsive to the will of the people. But how do you get the white upper class suburbanite to shop at the Walmart in the hood? How do you get the person in the hood to go to other, to volunteer at an all-white church without feeling like they'll be stereotyped or discriminated against or subject themselves to surveillance. Putting ourselves in places where we're not comfortable is required for this project to succeed, and it is also totally against our human nature to want to do. So to the extent we can incentivize those kind of connections, I think that gives us a shot, but barring that, I'm not sure.
And on that note, I believe our author will stay a couple of minutes to be able to answer additional questions if you have them. I want to give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Obviously given us a lot of hope, right? So for a country that for hundreds of years has practiced a type of racism that seems almost unbreakable, we think that it will inevitably see its future as connected with unpracticing that racism and recognizing that it can't actually be its best self in the world without ending racism in the US. That's the goal for everyone. And maybe the US gets there, but let's hope so. But I wanted to thank you for the book and Dan for the excellent moderation. I wanted to thank our live audience as well as our audience online for joining us today here at Perry Wohlhouse. Remind everyone that next Tuesday at this time, we're going to be featuring a program on Cuba. So please sign up and please check the chat for that link. You can also find a recording of this on YouTube. So you should look at that. For those of you who haven't joined our mailing list, please do. And again, all the links are in the chat, and we'll see you next time. Be well. Thanks everybody for coming out.